Hi everybody, thanks for taking the time to watch this video. This video is about asset location. This is an important topic that can have a significant impact on your taxes, but it's also relatively easy to implement. That's why I created an entire video and article devoted specifically to this topic. Before delving into the meat of this topic, I just want to remind you, asset location is just one facet of financial planning. You cannot truly optimize asset location without financial planning software and expertise. There are just too many different factors and dimensions to consider. Those of you who know me or have heard me speak know that I'm a big fan of a financial planning software called Income Solver. It's not the most user-friendly and it's not the prettiest software on the market, but I think it's got the best optimization engine that integrates most of the important factors that you need to work with in financial planning. The stakes are naturally high when it comes to retirement and financial planning, so you want to take the guesswork out of the equation. I find Income Solver is the best tool to do that. For now, I'm going to brush many of these details under the rug and focus on two intuitive rules of thumb that'll get you going in the right direction when it comes to asset location. But first, I'm going to revisit two background topics that will help us understand the context for asset location. The first background topic focuses on the types of taxes we pay. Asset location relates to both income and investment-related taxes. So these taxes are the first thing I want to revisit. As a reminder, income taxes are the taxes you pay on money you earn. That's going to be ordinary income that comes through on your tax return. Investment-related taxes are the taxes related to your portfolio and investments. These are things like dividends, interest, and capital gains. If you haven't already watched my videos or read my articles on these topics, I encourage you to do so before watching this video. The other background topic I want to discuss focuses on the primary types of investment accounts you have. They each have different ways that they are taxed, and it's important to understand this in the context of asset location. The first type of account is the taxable account, and it's just that, taxable. Interest, dividends, and capital gains are all taxable. There's no real tax benefits to speak of for these accounts except for a step up in basis. That is, if one passes and leaves their brokerage account to their heirs, the cost basis in the assets is stepped up to the current market value, so there's no taxes due on the growth up until that point. Next, we have our tax-deferred accounts. These are things like your 401ks, 403bs, and IRAs. There's no taxes on the dividends or interest or capital gains while the investments are inside of these accounts, but this is money that hasn't been taxed yet. So this money will ultimately be taxed as ordinary income when money is distributed outside of this account. Then we have our Roth accounts, like Roth 401ks and Roth IRAs. You pay taxes on the money when it goes into these accounts. However, there's no more taxes after that point. All of your dividends, interest, and capital gains, all of that growth is tax-free, and so are the distributions when you take that money out of these Roth accounts. There are some other investment vehicles with different tax characteristics, things like municipal bonds, life insurance, and annuities, but I'm not going to go into those in this video. Now we're going to get into the meat of this video about asset location, but this should not be confused with asset allocation. Asset allocation discusses how your portfolio is allocated across different asset classes like stocks, bonds, alternative investments, and so forth. Asset location discusses how assets are distributed across different types of accounts. So those are your brokerage accounts, tax-deferred accounts, and Roth accounts that we just discussed. One way to think about this is to think of your asset allocation as cups of different liquids, and then think of your different types of accounts as empty cups we have to pour that liquid into. If we have a stock allocation, do we put it in our IRA, our Roth IRA, or our taxable brokerage? That's what asset location is all about. So this brings us to our first rule of thumb, and that deals with how investment growth is taxed. Let's say we have an asset that we expect to grow significantly over the long term, like a stock allocation. The question becomes, where should we place this high growth asset? Let's say we put this higher growth stock allocation in a tax-deferred account, like a 401k or IRA. Over time, as these investments grow, we have to remember that ultimately, when we take money out of tax-deferred accounts, that money is taxed as ordinary income. So all of that future growth is going to be taxed as ordinary income. Now let's consider what would happen if we place this higher growth stock allocation in a taxable brokerage account. If we put it in a taxable brokerage and then we experience this future growth that we expect, when we do ultimately take money out, we're only going to pay capital gains on that growth. And that's going to be a much lower tax rate than ordinary income, as if we put it inside of a tax-deferred account. Even better, if we never sell that asset and we pass and hand it off to our heirs, under current tax law, they will receive a step up in basis, effectively paying no tax on all of that growth. Last but not least, now let's consider what would happen if we put this higher growth stock allocation inside of a Roth account. Inside of a Roth account, all of that money grows tax-free and it can be taken out tax-free as well. So that makes Roth accounts typically the best place to put your higher growth assets. After that, we would probably like to put them in the taxable brokerage where we would only pay capital gains or possibly get a step up in basis. And lastly, this rule of thumb says that the last place we want to put higher growth assets is inside of our tax deferred accounts where that growth is ultimately taxed as ordinary income. Now on to the second rule of thumb, and that has to do with asset tax efficiency. That is, how efficient is it to hold certain assets in the different types of accounts that we have? In order to think about this, let's consider a few different examples. The first example could be a stock like Berkshire Hathaway that doesn't pay any dividends. This is very tax efficient because there's no dividends to be taxed and there's no portfolio rebalancing that could trigger capital gains. Then we have exchange traded funds, or ETFs. Now these will typically pay dividends and there's going to be some taxes associated with those. However, the special thing about ETFs is that they received a special blessing from the IRS whereby they typically don't hand out any capital gains to their shareholders while holding the ETFs. Many people think that this blessing is actually synonymous with just having low turnover, as is the case with many index funds. However, that's not the case. ETFs actually have a special blessing whereby they can even have high turnover and not hand out capital gains to their investors. So those are some of what I would consider tax efficient investments. Investments that don't trigger many taxes for the investors while they're holding them in their accounts. Now we go on to tax inefficient investments. So the first one I'll consider are high dividend yield stocks. Because they have higher dividends, there's going to be more dividends and there's going to be more taxes on those dividends. The next step up would be high yield bonds. Because bond interest is taxable as ordinary income, that's going to trigger even more taxes. Then we could go out there and consider some of the more active funds like hedge funds out there that are actively trading and constantly triggering capital gains, sometimes short-term capital gains, which are taxed as ordinary income as well. But across the board, you can see that we have a spectrum of tax efficiency depending upon the types of assets that we own. The question is, where do we hold these assets? For assets that are tax efficient, we can hold them in taxable brokerage accounts because, well, they're tax efficient. For the tax inefficient investments on the right-hand side, we prefer to hold those in tax deferred accounts or in Roth accounts, whereby those accounts shield us from the taxes on those dividends, that interest, and those capital gains. That's the second rule of thumb, considering the tax efficiency of individual assets and using that to determine where we hold them. So those are my two rules of thumb when it comes to asset location. When we want to think about where to place assets that we're going to hold, we need to think about, one, minimizing the tax on the future growth, but also the tax efficiency of those assets while they're sitting in those accounts. Of course, you shouldn't use rules of thumb alone to do your financial planning. My goal with this video was just to give you some of the logic or intuition around asset location strategy. Financial planning is more involved and involves a lot more variables that you want to integrate, so proper planning software is critical. If you can't find or use software yourself, I do recommend you find a financial professional who can do it for you. I would, of course, be happy to help you out with any financial planning questions or challenges that you may have. I offer everybody a free consultation and it's really easy to set up. You just go to the contact page on my website and after a few clicks you can set up an in-person or Zoom meeting. Thanks again for taking the time to watch this video and have a great day.